Hey everybody, Professor Klein back here in the Human Anatomy Lab at Ohio University to bring you a demo, comprehensive demo on the Sagittal Head Model. Let's begin. All right, here we are with the Sagittal Head Model. This is a sagittal cut of the head, the face, the brain, the skull, everything in the head and the neck, and you can see it's the right side of the body. So sagittal cut, right side, that's what we're looking at. And I got another video talking through maybe 25% of what this video covers. This is a longer video. The other one is super short, but this one's going to cover everything in this model. And I'm using the manufacturer's list here, so I'm going to make sure I hit everything that's pertinent to human anatomy. All right, and if we're looking at the bone first, that's what you always want to start with, is the bone. You can see anything that looks like kind of whitish with some red in it. Here's some. That is bone, and bone is very superficial in the skull, and then it goes deep down the vertebral column. So let's look at some of them here. Looking at letter A, this is the parietal bone. Parietal bone. B, frontal bone, frontal, with the frontal sinus within it. C is coming out towards the nose, so this would be the nasal bone right here. The nasal bone is pretty short, and then it's just a lot of cartilage. So C is nasal bone. Jump over to here, and letter D is the ethmoid bone. This is like the roof of your nose. If you think nasal cavity right here, this is the nasal bone leading to the ethmoid bone. What's over here? Letter E, we're talking about the sphenoid bone. You gotta look really close to see that letter E, but this is the sphenoid bone. So up here would be the sphenoidal sinus, another sinus right in here. Keeping it going from E, we jump back to F, and F is way back here. Occipital bone, occipital bone. And I got another video on the entire skull. We're just looking at what's shown on this model. Next up, they jump all around here, but let's go back up to the front. Letter G is the maxilla. Now maxilla has teeth coming out of it. These white things here are the teeth. So G is maxilla. H, palatine. And actually, I would not fully agree with where this letter H is. I would say it's right where the probe is right now. So you see where the probe is? This is where letter H should be, the palatine bone. And of course, maxilla plus palatine equals the hard palate, which is not a bone, but that's the hard roof part of your mouth. After the palatine bone, we jump down to the mandible bone here. The mandible bone, letter I. And letter I also has teeth coming out of it. Jump down to letter K. K is a hyoid bone. Hyoid bone in the throat. And then finally, the vertebrae. The first two we want to note. Letter L is the atlas. And letter M is the axis. C1, C2, and then the rest you can just call general vertebrae of the cervical region. All right, next we get up to some brain structures here. So we're dealing with the brain area, and on the sheet here, it's got some really fancy words: telencephalon, diencephalon, mesencephalon, metencephalon, and myelencephalon as well. But really next to it and popping up on your screen will be some more general definitions of what those words mean. Those are general terms for areas of the brain. For example, the telencephalon, Roman numeral I, is this whole area. Roman numeral 2, the diencephalon, 2 is right here, but it's really the thalamus, the hypothalamus for the diencephalon. 3, the mesencephalon, midbrain, for the metencephalon, which is the cerebellum and the pons, cerebellum, pons, and finally my menincephalon, which is really just the medulla. So I'm focused more on the specific structures. So let's name them. Well, with the brain, you have the cerebrum. So all this kind of palish colored tissue here, brain tissue, is the cerebrum. But you do have the frontal lobe right here, the parietal lobe, and then all the way back the occipital lobe. All right, I actually have a brain model right here, and if I put them side by side, you can see that frontal lobe, you can see that parietal lobe, and that occipital lobe superior to what we call the cerebellum, which would be right in here. Can't really see the temporal lobe on the sagittal head, but you can see it on the brain as it is more lateral. Let's get that out of here though and back to here. And with this, you'll notice something blue. You guys see this blue one here coming all the way up and around. This is called the superior sagittal sinus. Now in between the brain and the skull, you have the sinus, which is a big vein, and you have the meningeal layers, dura mater, arachnoid mater, pia mater. In between the dura maters, like shown on this model here, if this is the dura mater, skull, brain, this thick layer here is the dura mater, it splits, and you have a perosteal dura mater and a meningeal dura mater layer. But notice this big gap of space, a lot of blood vessels go in here. This is called a dural venous sinus. Now specifically, this one is the superior sagittal sinus, which is an example of a dural venous sinus. So that's a lot just to say this is it, the superior sagittal sinus coming down here. Now what do you notice? Look real close, and there's no number, but there should be a number here, number 2. This double layered folding that wedges in between the cerebrum and the cerebellum is number 2, the tentorium cerebelli. And what that is it's a divider between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. And that brings us to number 3 here. Number 3, the whole structure that I'm pointing to is the cerebellum. The whole thing, brown. But the white structures, you guys see the white structures in here? The white structures are called the arbor vitae. The white branches are the arbor vitae. And of course, if we zoom out, the cerebellum is very much 3D. It's just shown in this cross section on the sagittal head model. What's next? We're going up to the corpus callosum, often called the corpus callosum. And this is the connector between the hemispheres. So this is a bridge between the right and left hemispheres of the brain. There is technically a rostrum, which is A, and a genu, which is B, but the whole thing, white part here, corpus callosum. 5 is the pellucid septum, and 5 is also where you might say the lateral ventricle would be. This space in here is the lateral ventricle. 6 is the fornix. Fornix right here. 7 and 9 go together. 7 is the anterior commissure. 9, this is 9, not a G, but a 9. This is the posterior commissure. What's 8? 8 is the interthalamic adhesion, that brown dot. And it's on top of the thalamus. So the thalamus would be number 10, but really it's this whole structure here. It's like a bubble, and that brown spot is on top of the thalamus, but the thalamus is right in here, which means 11, if this was a lateral ventricle, 11 would be the interventricular foramen. 12 would be the aqueduct of the midbrain coming down here, which the third ventricle would be right here. So cerebral aqueduct, the skinny part, or aqueduct of the midbrain is another way to say it. And then 13, it opens up into the fourth ventricle. I'm talking about ventricles here. Ventricles are space. So if I point at something and I say this is the third ventricle, I'm not pointing at anything. I'm just pointing at space, empty space here. But if I were to say I'm pointing at this exact structure where the probe is touching against the brain tissue, now I'm talking about the hypothalamus, this little area here, which is inferior to the thalamus. That leads out a little stalk or a bridge called the infundibulum to number 16, which is the pituitary gland. Pituitary gland 16 there. It sits within the bony landmark called the sella turcica. Remember that from the bone skull video. The sella turcica surrounds the pituitary gland. What's 15? 15 is the optic chiasm. Optic chiasm. Couple more to round out the brain structures. 17 is the mammillary body. 17, the mammillary body. 18, tectoral plate. Tectal plate, also called the quadrigeminal plate, which includes the superior colliculus, which would be up here, and the inferior colliculus, which would be down here. Pictures popping up on your screen for all these things, of course. 19, we're looking deep in here. This one I don't usually teach, but I'll mention it. It's the superior medullary velum within the cerebellum here. 20, I do teach the pons, which is actually this entire area, the bulge pons. 21, the medulla. And then 22, starting right about here, going all the way down, is the spinal cord. The spinal cord is in between the vertebrae. All right, pause the video, go back, rewatch those things if you need to, but we're moving on to the nasal cavity, the oral cavity, and the throat. Getting things started up in the nasal cavity, which would be this entire area right here. The external nares are the nostrils, so way out here, the nose, external nares. But as air comes in, it would travel in between these structures. These are the superior, middle, and inferior nasal concha. So this is the superior nasal concha, the middle nasal concha, and the inferior nasal concha. Notice how the top two are together, but the bottom one is separate. The inferior is unique where it's separated from the other two. Now in between these, you have a meatus, or a passageway. So inferior nasal meatus, middle nasal meatus, and superior nasal meatus, all leading back to this part, which is right in here. We call these the internal nares. External nares, internal nares. Different from D. D is the opening of the auditory tube, also called the pharyngeal tympanic tube, also called the Eustachian tube. So that's from your ear, and really I've got a model for that. So if you watch the ear video, you know the ear anatomy, and you know that this is the Eustachian tube right here. It helps with neutralizing pressure or dissipating pressure from the middle and inner ear. So this comes down, but where does this tube go? Well, it goes right into this spot posterior to the nasal cavity, letter D. That's the opening of that. E would be the pharyngeal recess, pointing to back here. Also looking at the pharyngeal tonsils, jump to this one right here. Pharyngeal tonsils is technically K. As we come down, the space shown here is the nasal pharynx. Nasopharynx is the space here. Oropharynx is the space between or behind, posterior to the oral cavity, the mouth. And we had mentioned the maxilla with the maxillary teeth on top, the mandible with the mandibular teeth, and these are both incisor teeth. So these are the ones that kind of rip and grip and tear food apart that are posterior to the lips. The tongue is right here. This is the tongue with some specific muscles. You can see the genioglossus muscle, the genohyoid muscle going down to the hyoid bone. And then I'll zoom in real close here for the mylohyoid muscle. Mylohyoid muscle. Zoom back out. We mentioned the hard palate, the soft palate, and this last little tip part here, the uvula, often called the palatine uvula, which makes this the palatine tonsils. Anything that's like this brownish color, pharyngeal tonsils, palatine tonsils right here. One more to mention around the oral region, and this is the orbicularis oris. So this muscle, it actually is up here, and it's actually down here. It's the muscle, and I'll turn it, that surrounds, there it is, surrounds the mouth and allows you to close your mouth tight, purse your lips. That's the orbicularis oris muscle right here. But as we continue down, we have the nasal pharynx, the oral pharynx, and then one of them called the laryngopharynx before you get to an area of the throat called the larynx. So this is the pathway into the trachea. The trachea would be down here. This is the pathway posteriorly into the esophagus. This is the esophagus right here. But what else are we looking at? This blue flap thing that would close when you are swallowing food to prevent food from going down the trachea is called the epiglottis. So Roman numeral 1 is the epiglottis. And the epiglottis is made out of elastic cartilage. Here's a picture of elastic cartilage histology for you on your screen. There's other types of cartilage called hyaline cartilage. Hyaline is a type of cartilage that can be found in different areas of the larynx. For example, this is a number 2 right here. Number 2 looks like a V, but it's actually a number 2. This is called the thyroid cartilage. The thyroid cartilage, and it's here, and it's also back here as well. Thyroid cartilage is made up of hyaline cartilage. So thyroid cartilage is just the name of it, but it's actually hyaline cartilage. Also number 3, some more hyaline cartilage, but this one's called the cricoid cartilage. Cricoid cartilage. Jump to the next one here, and you can see IV, and I really gotta say these numbers don't look super well on this, and this is the manufacturer here, so I'm gonna do my best to clarify that this is an I and a V if you're using this key right here. So IV, this one is referring to the thyrohyoid ligament. It's a ligament, and it's in between the hyoid bone and the thyroid cartilage, so it's called the thyrohyoid hyoid ligament. There's also a muscle in there as well, so a little bit of a muscle called the same thing. Now come down to here. This is the true V here, number 5, Roman numeral number 5. And this one's famous. This one is the cricothyroid ligament. You can also call it the cricothyroid membrane. And there's a procedure called the cricothyroidotomy where you cut into here and you open up someone's airway in an emergency situation through this membrane. So make sure you know Roman numeral number 5, the cricothyroid ligament. We got something else called the transverse arytenoid. And then notice these things in here. These are folds that would occur in the larynx. And this one right here is the vocal fold. And this one up here is the vestibular fold. Again, everything in the larynx leading to the trachea. The trachea starts right about here, inferior to the cricoid cartilage, and the esophagus being back here. All right, if you want to see this area on another model, I do have a different video on this model. This is the larynx model here. You can see I taped in an esophagus. You got the trachea down here. It shows things like the cricoid cartilage, the thyroid cartilage, and the hyoid bone with an actual movable epiglottis. So check that video out if you want more on this larynx model. All right, hang with me here. I did cover everything that is from this sagittal head side. I'm gonna flip it and teach you guys this side of it because this is not always shown on these models, but we have a special model that has both the lateral and medial view of the sagittal head model. So stop the video and go back if this is all you want to learn, but if you want to learn more, keep watching. All right, so we're looking at this side right now, and if we're looking at something red, we're talking about muscle with the white tendons right here. If it's yellow, that's a nerve. If it's blue, it's a vein. If it's red, it's an artery. So let's start naming a few things. Starting with this one on the top, number 24. It covers the frontal bone. So this muscle is called the frontalis muscle right here. But another way to name this is the frontal belly of the occipitofrontalis muscle. Well, let's keep going. And let's look back in here. I'll bring it up. 24A is the epicranial aponeurosis. This big, thick band of connective tissue that's white on top of your skull is the epicranial aponeurosis. Coming back here, though, we got another one. We got 25. Let me lay it back down. 25. That is the occipitalis. You could also call it the occipital belly of the occipitofrontalis. Now, what is the occipitofrontalis? That's a muscle of the frontalis, the epicranial aponeurosis, and the occipitalis together. So 1, 2, 3 things make that one muscle up, and they often operate together. Next, you'll see a couple around the ear. The auricle. 67 here is the auricle, the outer part of the ear. But it's got a muscle 26 on the posterior side and a muscle on the anterior side. 26 is going to be the auricularis posterior, and 27 is the auricularis anterior. Makes sense? One on the front, one on the back. Up here, number 28, we're talking about the temporoparietalis. It's from the temporal bone up to the parietal bone. You might be able to feel that one right superior to your ear. keeping it going. Let's come to the front. And looking here, we can see the orbicularis oculi. See this circular muscle surrounding the eye? 29 here, this is the orbicularis oculi. Now the eye is shut right now, very tightly shut, and that's because this is the orbital part of that muscle, but there's also a palpebral part of this muscle in here. So this is still the orbicularis oculi as it covers the eye itself. Whole thing, orbicularis oculi. Then we jump over here, and I'm coming from the side. See this one covering the nose, 31? That's the nasalis muscle. Nasalis, over to the nose. 32 is the longest named muscle in the body. 32, there's two different heads to it here. It's called the levator labii superioris alcalae nasi. Take a break after saying that one, because that is the longest named muscle in the body. They call it the Elvis muscle. As you can see here, Elvis doing his classic smirk where he raises a little bit of his nose and his lip, and he uses the levator labii superioris alcalae nasi to do that. So they nicknamed it the Elvis muscle. Next up, we got the levator labii superioris. That's just this one here, number 33. 34 is the zygomatics minor. Zygomatics minor. 35, I had already mentioned this one. Might remember it from this side of things as letter G. That is the orbicularis oris. Orbicularis. Orbicularis means circular. Oris is mouth. But remember that orbicularis oculi? Circular muscle, oculi, eyes. But back to that orbicularis oris number 35. 36 coming in here is the zygomatics major. 34 minor, 36 major. What's 37? It's tucked deep in there. It's the buccinator. Buccinator or buccinator, also pronounced, is 37. 38, rizoris. Rizoris coming across, and let me zoom out for you. Rizoris, number 38. Next up, 39, lots of facial muscles here. 39 is the depressor anguli oris. And I'm just gonna name these here for you. 40, depressor labii inferioris. 41, mentalis. 42, masseter. 43, and here you can see the sternocleidomastoid. Look real close, it's number 43, and it's coming down here where the clavicle and the sternum would be, and it's coming all the way up to the mastoid process right behind your ear. But it's not number 52. 52 is the levator scapulae, which you'll see later on. Lastly, on this page, 44, which is deep down in here, digastric. Digastric. Keeping it rolling, 45 is the stylohyoid. Stylohyoid. We're getting into a lot of muscles that I do not teach in my lab, but I'm covering it because I want to cover a comprehensive overview of this model. 46 coming out here. This is the mylohyoid. 46, mylohyoid. 47, sternohyoid. If If you focus on the throat muscles, these are really important muscles to know. 48. Let me zoom in to 48 here. 48, thyrohyoid. Thyrohyoid. This is the hyoid bone, so thyrohyoid. 49, superior belly of the omohyoid or omohyoid muscle. 49. 50, we got to come back here. And 50, I'm going to turn this up. 50 is the upper trapezius. Upper trapezius. You can just call it the trapezius, but it's that muscle right there. You can also see, zoom in here, 51. 51 is the splenius capitis. Notice the different muscle fiber directions. Splenius capitis goes like this. Trapezius travels the other way. 52. 52 is back here. This was the sternocleidomastoid. 52 is the levator scapulae. Levator scapulae. 53. 53 is the scalenus medius. Scalenus medius. Which makes 54 the scalenus anterior. And 55, way up here, gotta look super deep in there for it, semispinalis capitis. Semispinalis capitis. All right, we're on to some arteries here, and we're getting there. Hang with me here, we're getting there. Arteries, veins, nerves, right in here. And what we can see here in red is 56. This is the common carotid artery. It's a big artery in your neck, and it's coming up, and it splits a ton. And one of the splits is 57 here. Looking at 57, there's the number, but it's this entire red thing. That's the facial artery. We're looking at the face. This is the artery that goes to the face. 58, this is the transverse facial artery. So another facial artery, but this one's called the transverse facial artery because it's transverse. 59, we're talking about the superficial temporal artery. Superficial temporal coming up this way. Lots of splits though. Let's look at 60. 60 is the posterior auricular artery. Auricular. Now we're talking about 60 right there. 61, way back here. Which lobe are we by? We're by the occipital lobe, so this is the occipital artery. Occipital artery, right here, 61. Time for the veins, the blue ones here. This front one here is the anterior jugular vein. 62 is the anterior jugular vein. 63 is the external jugular vein. External jugular vein, 63 right there. Kind of hard to see, but that is a 63. 64, deep down in here is the internal jugular vein, and oftentimes there's a lot of anastomoses or connections between these veins. 64 is the internal jugular vein. 65, it's next to the facial artery, so this is the facial vein. 65 is the facial vein, which makes 66 back here next to the occipital artery, the occipital veins. Oftentimes arteries and veins are named the same thing. One's an artery, one's a vein. All right, nerves are up next, yellow, and these are tough, so I'm going to walk you through these. This is the facial nerve right here going out to the muscles of facial expression. It does branch a ton, but they stop it right about here. This one, which is D is the buccal nerve, buccal or buccal, popping up on your screen. That is this nerve right here. What's E? E is the marginal mandibular branch of the facial nerve. And really, we're on a grad school level here. So if you've never heard of these and you're an undergrad or high school, don't worry about them so much. But if you want to learn, I'm telling you exactly what they are on that higher level. This is the marginal mandibular branch of the facial nerve. Back here we got a couple. We got the accessory nerve. This one typically taught in high school and college. This one innervates the trapezius. So you'll notice traveling back to the trapezius, that is the accessory nerve. Over here, L is the supraclavicular nerve. Supraclavicular, coming down this way. And G up here, we're talking about the great auricle or auricular nerve. Great auricular nerve, G. And wedged in there, F, this one makes sense. It's the posterior auricular nerve. Posterior to the auricle, coming down. Keeping it going way back here. You can see an eye. You guys see that eye right there? That eye is talking about the greater occipital nerve. Greater occipital nerve going to the occipital area. Up here we got a couple as well, hopping around but covering all of them. B is the auriculotemporal nerve. Auriculotemporal nerve right here, going from the auricle to the temporal lobe. Which makes C is the zygomatic nerve. The zygomatic bone is real close to this nerve. C is the zygomatic nerve. All right, gotta finish out here. 67, external ear or the auricle, flappy part of the ear. And then lastly, this brown thing is the parotid gland. It's the largest salivary gland in the body. You can kind of see another one here, submandibular gland, but it's not labeled, so just parotid gland, which produces saliva. Okay, that's it. That's all I can teach you because that's everything on this model. Again, this is the super comprehensive video, super long, go through everything. The other one is shorter and it kind of focuses in on some of the more commonly seen anatomy from this model. But comment below if you have any questions or if this helped you or any mnemonics you might have for some of this anatomy. I'm Professor Klein from the Human Anatomy Lab at Ohio University. Thanks for watching.